Howdy, folks. Today, we're diving into one of the biggest creative questions in photography in general. Where exactly do we draw the line between honest image making and full blown digital artwork? We're talking post production, visual storytelling, and how to use Photoshop without losing the soul of your photography right after this. Welcome to Camera Shake, where we bring you the insider scoop on all things photography and videography, giving you a unique opportunity to stay ahead of the curve. We've spent literally hundreds of hours interviewing some of the most renowned photographers of our time, giving you access to knowledge and information, and expertise even, that's not available anywhere else. As always, I'm your host, Kirsten Nuts, and if you're like me and you enjoy free podcasts and YouTube content, you can become a supporter of the show by buying us a coffee over on buymeacoffee.com/camera shake to help us create even more exciting episodes for you. But of course, you're more than welcome to say no, no hard feelings. Just know that your support really does make a difference. Mainly, it keeps me in coffee. That's always a good thing. Also, if you want to stay up to date with future episodes, tips from our guests, and behind the scenes goodies, you can now sign up for our regular newsletter over at camerashakepodcast.com. Now, without further ado, let's give it up for today's special guest, founder of the Photoshop training channel, educator, speaker, and Photoshop wizard galore, Jesús Ramirez. How's it going, man?
Thank you so much, Kenson. I'm doing fantastic. How are you?
I'm very well. Did I pronounce your name correctly?
Yeah, you did, and I think I mispronounced your name.
That happens to me all the time.
Yeah.
No
No,
problem
no,
at
no, no. I wanted to get it right. So how do you pronounce it?
So technically, well, I pronounce it Kirsten.
But technically, you said technically. What does
Yeah,
that
so it's
mean?
actually the origin of my name is German or
Uh-huh.
Scandinavian. Well, and so in Germany, people will pronounce it Karsten rather than Kirsten.
Karsten.
But
Okay.
you know,
Karsten.
it's Karsten with like an open E.
Karsten. Oh
Yes,
man.
as I know, it's complicated. The funny thing about this is there's so many variants of that name in Germany
Mm-hmm.
alone, and then across
Mm-hmm.
Scandinavia, there's even more.
Sure.
There's like Kirsten, Kirstine, Karsten, Karsten with a C, with there's
Yeah.
infinite variations that nobody ever gets it right. So I'm perfectly used to that. No problem.
Well, you know what? Here you go. If you really wanted to, I'm not saying you should, but people who speak Spanish will pronounce my name Jesus, which nobody can say it if you don't speak Spanish. So I completely understand the dilemma you're going through.
Yeah, because so it's Jesus. Or it's the
That's very close. That's very close.
hey,
Jesus. Yeah.
cool, perfect. All right, so we're talking, bridging photography and digital art today. But before we get into that, um, for listeners who don't know, give us a bit of a background story behind the Photoshop training channel.
hmm Yeah. So the Photoshop training channel is a YouTube channel where I teach Photoshop. It's in the name. I've been doing it since July of 2012. So it's been quite a while. I don't know the exact number, but I know that I'm over 2 million subscribers at the moment. And yeah, it's something that I've been doing for quite a while. I really enjoy it. That's only half of my job. The other half of my job is I create TV and movie posters. So I'm a digital artist. So I do a little bit of both.
Yeah, so one of our former guests, Lisa Connie, has
hmm
that I've spoken to, and I speak to her, once in a while. And
Yeah.
she's, she constantly references your name as well in in that genre of a movie. And
Yeah, she's very sweet and very kind, but I mean, for the people that are in the industry know that Lisa is a legend. She's been doing this since the 90s. So here I'll tell you a quick story. My wife and I went to Lisa's house about a year ago. She lives near Tahoe in California, and we were just watching Netflix. And as we were scrolling through Netflix, she kept going, "I made that poster. I made that poster. I made," like, seriously, like every other poster was hers. So I'm 100% sure your listeners have seen a million of her work and without realizing it.
I had the very same experience as well. In fact, when I had her on the show a little while ago, we were
hmm
talking about a particular Netflix show, and I remember saying something like, "Oh yeah, I think we were talking about black and white posters or something like that."
hmm
And I said, "Oh, this is this stunning, it's a TV show, and the artwork is stunning, blah blah blah." And she goes, "Yeah, yeah, made that."
Yep.
And then she showed me one of the original shots that she
hmm
had as a
Oh
basis
yeah.
to that. And it was like somebody just snapped that with their iPhone, and it was
Yes.
terrible.
Yeah, so what I think people don't realize, I didn't realize it till I started working in the industry, is that a lot of the photos that we get to use for these posters are terrible, to say the least. They, as you mentioned, feels like somebody just took out their phone, took a quick snap, and then there you go, got a picture for the movie poster or TV show. And our job is to take a really bad quality photo and make it look like it belongs in a movie poster.
It's an interesting thing because my impression has always been, and I think most people would have thought that, is that when you talk about movie posters, for movie productions or like or big
Mhm.
Netflix TV shows with I don't know probably tens of millions, hundreds of millions
Mhm.
maybe of dollars of budget, do you think there'd be more production value behind creating the original image?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna say it never happens, but it happens a lot less than you would think.
We have to dive into that specifically. I think we have to make a specific episode about that.
For sure,
Uh,
for sure.
Now, you've worked with Adobe.
Yes.
You've spoken at Max. You've
Yes.
judged competitions. Um, how did your journey evolve from artist to educator?
It's an interesting thing, I I I've always enjoyed teaching, and I kind of wanted to do it, but I realized that the phrase, it really is who you know, right? And I realized I didn't know anyone. So I needed to make connections. So Photoshop World, a conference, 2013, about a year after I started my YouTube channel, I went to Photoshop World in Las Vegas, and I just thought to myself, all right, where can I go meet a bunch of people who do what I would want to do? And Photoshop World Las Vegas was coming up, and I thought to myself, this will be a great opportunity to go meet people. So I did, and, I thought I was super cool because I had a YouTube channel that had, like, 2,000 subscribers at that point, and,
Welcome to the club.
yeah. And, I went and I met people and, like, I was very, very fortunate. I wish I could, give you a recipe of, like, "Oh, this is what you do and what you say." I just first night, and we're at the Mandalay Bay, and I believe the bar is called the Candy Bar or something along those lines, and there's a bunch of people from the conference, and literally the first person I talked to ended up becoming now one of my best friends, Mark Keeps. Shout out to Mark Keeps, and he was involved in a lot of this world, and through him I met some people, and through those people I met other people, and they recommended me to this, recommended me to that, and next thing you know, I'm getting invited to do all these different things. What I do like to tell people is that I was very fortunate and very lucky, but I was also very prepared. I was prepared to take on those opportunities. So it's not that had I met these people maybe 5 years before, I would have not been ready and nothing would have come of it. But I was already working on my YouTube channel. I was already, working on me becoming a trainer, if that's the word I want to use for this, instructor. So I was fortunate that I met the right people at the right time. I was prepared to take those opportunities.
It's an interesting thing, what you're saying, because I completely agree with that. And, I I've heard this story several times in the past. In a way, a friend of mine, Dave Clayton, who does a lot
Mhm.
of
Yeah.
Photoshop training.
He's a good friend of mine, yeah, out of
Yeah,
Swindon, UK. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, just down the road from me. Yeah, it's a very good friend.
Oh,
So
really?
you can
Yeah.
already see
I so quick story, I went to Swindon to visit Dave, and, as you know, he's a big football fan,
Oh
and we're
yes,
talking real football, we're not talking American football here. And so he said, "Hey, come out and play with my friends." I said, "Alright," and he was surprised that I was a good footballer because I scored 2 goals on, with playing with his, like, it was like a semi-organized thing, like, it was not completely a pickup game, but it was not completely organized, somewhere in the middle. Anyway, side story, go ahead, please.
well, it's fantastic. I get a lot of his football news. In fact, I was commenting on one of his posts today, which was all about
Mm.
football.
Yeah.
So
Last comment, his daughter just, signed for a professional team.
yeah,
Elise, I believe her name is, yeah.
absolutely, yeah. Again, Dave also, he's been on the show several times.
Mhm.
And I'll call him a good friend of mine.
Yeah.
So you can already see this industry is surprisingly small. It's
Yes.
actually, we've already discovered two mutual contacts, mutual friends that
Exactly.
we have. So um, now, what is your personal philosophy when it comes to retouching and image manipulation? Because I preface that by for some context, just before we went live, we had a conversation. One of the things I said was, one of the most common sort of comments I get in, like, let's say in camera clubs, for example, is that there's this sort of, this dividing line between, in
Mhm.
people's heads anyway, between, true photography in inverted commas, and digital art, and maybe, and even AI coming into that now as well.
Mhm.
Um, so I just want, I'd like to know, like, for somebody who deals with that every day, and who's sort of at the forefront of that technology evolving, literally, it seems week by week.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, what is your sort of personal philosophy when it comes to that?
I mean, there's 2 things, right? Like, how I feel about it personally and what reality is. And what I mean by that is the reality is everyone's reality is different. For example, if I'm a journalist, I may not wanna use AI at all. I may not wanna use the clone tool. I may not wanna use like, I wanna have a photo that is as true as possible to the event that I'm capturing, because that's my job, a journalist. But someone like me who's creating movie posters, there is no end. I can push the line as far as I can as long as I get the result that I want. And we both live in very different realities. So my reality, how I feel about it is there is no end. But there's also that other side of the coin where there shouldn't be anything really besides maybe even minor um like color adjustments or tone adjustments, just very light, if that, And then some people want to draw the line, and to me that makes no sense. Like, where do you draw the line? As I said, we live in different realities, and if you really think about it, when you snap a photo, you're already the demosaicing process from taking a digital image into what we visually see on our screens. There's a color profile in there, right? Like if you're using Adobe products as the Adobe default profile, but there's every manufacturer has a different profile. So even at that point, we're already doing some digital imaging based on what the company defaults are for their profile. So where do we draw the line? Is that the line? And if so, why is that the line? Why does company A have a better profile than company B? Like you see, I don't know if I'm making my point clear. Um, all I'm trying to say is that it depends on what you're doing with that photo, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and that's actually, that's the, I think the most consequential question is the question of why. You know,
Mhm,
um, why why is, what kind of, what limitations are you setting on that particular image because of, what am I trying to say? Because of the end use of it. Like, the
mhm,
best way to explain it in my head, it's always, okay, let's say it's a competition image.
mhm.
The question then is, well, what category is it in that
Yes.
particular competition?
Mhm,
Is it nature, for example? Well, then you're very limited in what you can show, because you're trying to show and depict nature in its truest form.
mhm,
You know, so cloning in, I don't know, extra puppies might,
mhm.
might not be a
Yeah.
good idea. Um, but if it's a different category, like, I don't know, art,
Mhm.
then there might not necessarily be a boundary at all. When
Yeah.
it comes to movie process, that's actually something that's just personal interest. Do you have any limitations that are set to you by, let's say, the director, or is it like basically just go all out and create something cool?
I've never been involved in a project where the director himself or herself have made specifics to the poster, but it does happen. Um, so I guess I should explain how this industry works a little bit. So I am what they call a finisher, which is the last chef on that kitchen that cooks the meal. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of processes that go through before I even touch the Photoshop file. So I have very little creativity in what goes in that portrait size poster, but that's not what I create. I create like a giant, you know, rectangle horizontal, that then the poster gets this cut out of. So like that poster part, I have very little creative say in it, but anything outside of that, I have a lot of creative say in it. And the reason being is that poster image that you see gets seen by legal, gets seen by art directors, by a whole bunch of people, sometimes too many people, in my opinion. But everybody's got a say in it, and I have very little creative direction. But then anything outside of that, I have almost endless um, creative freedom as long as it fits the context of that portrait, if that makes any sense. One of the first steps is the design process. As a finisher, I'm not involved in the design process. I'm only involved in taking that concept, that design idea, and then making it into what you see on screen on Netflix, as we were discussing earlier.
So would you get an actual sketch of it, or would it
I've
already?
gotten Yeah,
Yeah,
I've gotten sketches, and I've also gotten really rough Photoshop cutouts where, like, we have the actor here, but it's a really bad mask, and this is the background, and, we want, I don't know, like a horse here, but it's just like a, horse with the white background, you know what I mean? So, like, it's very loose. And other times, it can be, quote, unquote, "almost finished," where they just want me to do the fine tuning, get the details right, so it varies.
I want to see those rough sketches. That'd be hilarious.
Yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, I'm under NDA, so I can't show them. Otherwise, I would show them on my YouTube channel. But a lot of the times, I'm like, "Oh man, this would make such a good video because of whatever the reason." But I can't show them publicly, especially unretouched celebrities.
Yeah.
That would really get me in trouble.
Yeah, it'd be funny though. It'd be funny. It's
Oh,
like the alternative version of this movie.
well, I always tell people, when you look at a movie poster, realize that someone like me has spent 20, 30 hours on it, and the person does not look like that. Like even that person does not look like that.
It's
And it's not up to me. Oh,
yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
No, it's an interesting thing. So I had Mark Vieira on the show a little while ago, and we were
Okay.
talking about retouching in during the golden era of Hollywood. So we're talking 1920s, 1930s.
Mhm.
Um, the George Hurrell, Sinclair Bull kind of era, and it was
Mhm.
really just I found it very fascinating to talk with him about the retouching techniques back then, and even
Yeah.
how far retouches went
Mhm.
even back then.
Sure.
We have this misconception nowadays. It's like, oh, it's all Photoshop. Well, you have
Yeah.
no idea. I mean, they went way overboard in some
Sure.
cases,
Yeah.
and it
Yeah.
was really interesting to see. You know, on some occasions, to see the
Mhm.
unretouched version of that photo, and then the retouched version. Bearing in mind this was done manually
Mhm.
80, 90 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, it's a fascinating thing.
Yeah. It's, without naming exactly who, I spent, man, like 4 hours on someone's hands just because the art director wanted extremely young hands on a older actor. And I am, so personally, I don't think you should over retouch. Like when I retouch, for me, that, there's no art director involved or no agency involved, I'm actually not as heavy-handed as they want me to be in the Hollywood industry. And my personal belief is that if it's a part of you, you shouldn't remove it. Maybe minimize it to make it less distracting. So, for example, if you have a really deep wrinkle, I wouldn't remove it. Maybe minimize it. But if you have like pimples, they'll be gone in a week. So yes, of course I'll remove them. But that is not what they want in the entertainment industry, and they sign checks, and, I'm a hired gun. So that's but I do make them push me, because usually my first round is, "This is how I would do it." And then usually they say, "No, that's not enough, push it even further."
Well, because I mean that would have been my next question. Is there like do you have like a limit where you basically say, well, I'm not gonna push it any further than that, or is it literally a matter of you know if the art director goes that no, we're gonna have to go all out, then
Yeah,
all the
like, I
gloves.
haven't there was only one project that I was involved in that I felt it was extremely unethical, and thankfully, the project didn't end up going anywhere, just because, I was working with an agency here in the States, but they were working on a TV show in Mexico, and the actress, now in her late 50s, wanted to be Photoshopped. This is one of the first times that I was involved in a project where the talent themselves was like, "No, I want this on my photo." And this woman wanted to look like she was in her 20s, now her being in her 50s. And, that not only requires a lot of photoshopping, but it's also, in my opinion, unethical. And she ended up not liking the work that the agency that was hired to create the poster, that hired me eventually to create the poster. She wasn't happy with that. So it ended up not going into production. But that was one of the times that I felt that that was an extreme edit, and thankfully it didn't go into production.
Hey, let me just jump in real quick to tell you about the amazing sponsor of this episode, Platypod. Platypod offers innovative camera support systems designed to unleash your creativity. With their stable, versatile, and portable solutions, you can capture stunning shots like never before. And I'm not just saying that. As the host of the Camera Shake podcast, I can personally vouch for Platypod's incredible products. They've become an integral part of the show. In fact, I'm surrounded by various Platypod products holding up lights, cameras, microphones, and so on. It's really helped to transform the way I make the show and the way I shoot at home, in the studio, and on location. But don't just take my word for it. Explore Platypod's website at www.platypod.com to discover their range of products, including the Platypod Extreme, Platypod tripod heads, and the brand new handle, of course. Make sure to follow Platypod on Instagram and Facebook at Platypod Tripods for exclusive updates, tips, and giveaways. By choosing Platypod, you're not only investing in your photography, but you're also supporting the Camera Shake Photography Podcast. Thanks again to Platypod, our amazing sponsor. Platypod, where innovation never sleeps. See, I've come across that myself, a number of times. I shoot headshots, or a lot of headshots, both for corporates and actors sometimes. And especially, I'd say especially with corporate headshots, on occasion, I have a client who has very specific ideas when it comes to the way they want to be, retouched. I remember one particular instance where, I shot a lady, and she was really stunning, a really good-looking lady. When she came to review the final images, she had an issue with the size of one of her eyes, which arguably was a tiny little bit bigger than the other.
Sure.
But I'll be honest with you, if you didn't know, if you weren't told that, you probably most likely wouldn't have
Sure.
noticed even.
Sure.
But it's one of these things. I appreciate that you look at yourself in a completely different light than the way that other people perceive you.
Absolutely.
And so she insisted that I would equalize, those eyes. And I remember in the first moment I thought, oh, I don't know if I'm not sure whether I want to do that. But you're quite right. She's signing the check. So let's go.
Yeah. There's been a couple of times where I'm like, really, I roll my eyes, but I'm like, all right, it's not that big of a in the grand scheme of things, it's not that big of a deal, and they're signing a check, so it is what it is.
Yeah.
But only that one instance that I told you about is where I felt really uncomfortable.
Yeah. I sometimes have requests when it comes to lightening skin, especially people with a slightly darker skin tone. And this was, to be honest with you, now I expect it almost, because I've come across that, especially in those communities. It's very common. And I'm so used to it now. It doesn't surprise me anymore. But I remember when I first started out, I was like, really? Like, why?
Yeah.
But then, being fairly fair skinned, this is really just, I think I want to appear darker.
Right.
That's my thing. But
Yeah.
it was interesting. It's definitely a
Well,
learning curve.
it's funny. I was involved in a project where I kind of got the opposite. It was a project where there was an actor with darker skin complexion holding a phone, but there was nothing on the phone. It was just like a blank screen. But I had to make it look like it was shining light onto the person. So then, if the phone is up and shining light into a person, they will have their face will be brighter. So I brightened their face, and they were like, "Oh, no, we cannot brighten people's faces who have darkened skin tone." And I was like, "Well,
Oh,
I'm not really doing." It's like it's casting a light onto the that's what would happen if the person
yeah.
had a phone, and they were like, "No." I was like, "Okay, you're signing the checks."
And that's the other thing. I always wonder, like, how far do you push the envelope in order to keep that sense of realism in there?
Yeah, yeah, and it's I don't know. I guess it's subjective to a degree, and then I guess people are trying to avoid getting canceled. Who knows?
When you look at people's edits,
Mhm.
in general, what would you say is one of the sort of most common mistakes that you see photographers make when they edit their own images? And I'm sort of in my head, I'm thinking in particular, when it comes to portrait images, for example. Let's start with portrait images.
Mhm.
What would you say is like one of the most common mistakes that you see all the time?
I think, at least in my world, oversaturation is probably one. I think that people oversaturate things. I feel a lot of people crank up the blues for some reason, and I kind of get it. They're probably trying to do the, orange blue, color combination thing. That's
Mm.
one. Um, Over sharpening might be another one where you could really see the, like the edges, the haloing effect. When it comes to portraits, I think those are probably the two biggest that I see.
The over sharpening thing is actually an interesting thing because I have to admit, I'm often questioning myself
Mhm.
as to whether I've gone overboard with sharpening. And this is in my psyche, it's the natural
Yeah.
thing. I think.
Yeah.
Um, how do you approach sharpening, and what is
Oh,
your
man. So I've gotten worse instead of improving, and the reason I gotten worse is because working with movie posters, they want you to push because, like, as we were saying earlier, that we get these images that are not the best images, and one of the ways of creating the illusion of high quality is sharpness. So we have to push not only, like, the sharpen slider or the R-sharp mask in Photoshop or do the high pass, sharpening technique. There's all these different things that we do to create the illusion of high quality, so, like, now my eye is not as good as it was, I think, because 'cause I'm so used to pushing things, but to answer your question, as silly as it sounds, if I'm using Lightroom, for example, the sharpening slider has, like, a little red gradient that once you start getting to the red, it's warning you, like, "Hey, you don't wanna go this far unless you really intend to." So I try to, like, keep it below the red, and that's what I do. Also, another tip, to be quite frank with you, is I do go into the if you're using Lightroom Camera or Camera Raw, you can, go into the masking drop down, because when you drag the slider, there's a little drop down next to it, the sharpening slider. If you expand that, there's some masking slider, and if you hold Alt on Windows or Option on the Mac and drag that slider, you can actually see where the sharpening effect is applied, and the further right you drag that slider, it will be concentrated more on the edges of the image rather than other details that you may not want to include that sharpening effect, and that also can help alleviate some issues.
That's definitely something I do. I always use the sharpening mask, just to,
Mhm.
dial that back to minimum. The other thing that I've noticed in my own editing is, especially since the advent of, the clarity slider in
Yes.
Lightroom,
Yes.
which everyone went way overboard with when that first
Yes.
came out. Um, but my sense is always that a number of different processes that I use to get the look that I want to get, all adds up to the impression of sharpening.
Mhm.
Um, and what I find is then when I apply the final sharpening at the very end, it very quickly kicks the whole thing overboard. Like for instance,
Mhm.
I like a bit of clarity because I like that
Mhm.
contrast. I like contrasty
Sure.
things. And the minute you dial up the contrast, you sort of create the illusion of something being sharper than it
Mhm.
actually is.
Mhm.
And then it's really easy to just you know go way overboard with that.
Yeah, yeah, and I don't know if this has happened to you, but a lot of the times, if I come back to something I edited 2 weeks ago and I look at it, I'm like, "Oh my god, this is too much," and then
Yeah,
I'll dial it back a little bit.
yeah, absolutely. I've also noticed that the screen makes a huge difference.
Yes, yes.
That's I like for some reason I like editing on that 5K screen behind me,
Mhm.
just
Mhm.
because to me I can see things better on it. It's just
Mhm.
it's a different sort of visual experience, and I think I can keep myself in check better
Right.
than when I edit something on my laptop, for example, which is generally
Mhm.
not a
Yeah.
good idea.
Another tip that I would give people is to view the image at 100%, also actual size, rather than zoom in really close or zoom out, because when you're viewing it at 100% or actual size is the closest representation to what it actually looks like, rather than a scaled up or scaled down version of it when you're viewing it.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that I come across a lot is that kind of plasticky skin look,
Mhm.
where,
Yeah, yeah,
um,
yep.
and I think that's actually that's kind of gotten worse recently since the advent of certain AI tools in
Mhm.
Lightroom,
Yeah.
and additional um, software packages, like Apathy, for example, or
Mhm.
what is it, Portrait Pro,
Mhm.
things like that,
Mhm.
where all of a sudden you very quickly end up falling into the trap of
Yeah.
adding all of these effects on top of each
Mhm.
other. You maybe do some skin smoothing in Lightroom
Yeah.
to start with, then you hit Evoto or Apathy or something, and
Mhm. Mhm.
and
Mhm.
by the end of it, you get the final result, and you're like, "Whoa, okay, something's
Yeah.
something's
But,
way overshot here."
it's funny that you're bringing this up. The way that I equate it to is, when 3D animation first started getting popular, it looked too clean, too perfect. We're
Yes.
talking about maybe late 90s or something. It just looks too perfect. And I think that's where we are right now with all these tools that you mentioned, like Evoto. I actually do like Evoto a lot. It's a very good app. Um, But I think that eventually we're gonna move to kind of where animation is now, where it looks more real because it's imperfect. It doesn't look super straight. There's imperfections. There's imperfections in reality, and I think that's what all these tools unfortunately remove. But I don't think it's the fault of the tool. I think it's the fault of the artists who are working on these images because it's very easy to just drag a slider and just everything disappears, rather than before where you had to do everything manually. You had to do everything, using frequency separation or God knows what, before. And so you had a lot of choice in what you were editing. Now, since you just drag a slider, everything goes away. So it makes it easy to go overboard. So I think the solution eventually would be for artists to, not to be aware of what they're doing. And this actually leads me to another point where I am not against AI or any of these tools that do automatic fixes by just dragging a slider. The way that I see it is we were always art directing. Even before all these AI tools, we were always art directing. The only difference is that before we were using our hand and our mouse and we would drag the spot healing brush tool over an area or whatever it was. Now we may do a selection and type in a prompt, but we're still art directing. It's my value as an artist is not that I know a keyboard shortcut that you don't know or where to find a menu, in a drop down. Um, I'd like to think at least that my value is my eye, and now we're having new interfaces to output the art that we want to create. And that's why I don't think AI is dangerous because it was never that, oh, I was so good at using the clone stamp tool and now AI does it in 2 seconds. Like, no, like that's never been my value.
I think you're right. I mean, I think we're in this sort of phase where it's like you said, we're getting used to these new tools, and
Mhm,
just like, and I remember it really well, when Lightroom first came out, the clarity slider,
mhm,
and
mhm,
everybody just went
mhm,
crazy. Everything you saw on like face people putting stuff on
mhm.
Facebook, you go, what the heck is happening there?
Yep.
But of
Yeah.
course, it's also sort of a sign of the time because I remember at the time everybody was like, oh, this looks really cool because it's like new and different.
Mhm,
And now I look back at some images that and I remember it was, let me see, it must have been around 2013, around about
mhm,
that time. And sometimes like especially on Facebook, other platforms are
mhm.
available, but sometimes these things pop up. Yeah, on this day 9 years ago, right? And
Yeah,
then your
yeah,
post was on, and so I see some of the images that I post back down. I'm thinking, what the
yeah.
hell? Oh my god!
But that's a good thing. I always tell people that's a good thing because if you still think they look good, it means you haven't improved.
Yeah, but exactly, absolutely, you're absolutely right. That's exactly how I look at it. But it's funny, it's funny, and you can see the
Mhm.
preference of certain tools
Yes.
at certain times.
Yes.
And I tell you what, I find at the moment, because I feel I'm in this transitional period where, I'm taking advantage of some of those AI tools because they save me time and
Mhm.
they simplify
Sure.
my workflow, and and
Absolutely.
that's great. Um, but I'm also still learning how to really fit them into my workflow in order to
Mhm,
get the result that I want to get. And I'm also finding that there's always compromises that
mhm,
have to be made. Like the result is never going to be totally identical with the thing that I can't retouch. You mentioned frequency separation. Loved it. Lisa told me everything I know.
mhm. Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
um, and I like the process. I actually I like the process.
There's
Uh,
something therapeutic about it for me.
Absolutely, I like the painting. I like that. I like the control that I have. I like the way I can
Mhm,
shape a face. Um, I like the fact that I'm in control of the degree of realism or not. That
mhm.
I just like that haptic feel of doing it that way.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and with tools, more modern tools, slider based tools, let's say, I always find, at the moment at least, I find that I apply them, and I find that there's a point where I feel that's gone too far. Then I dial it back. Then I still go into Photoshop and I still use frequency separation
Mhm,
to
mhm,
adjust certain things so they are where I want them to be. So it hasn't, to me, at least at the moment, it hasn't gotten rid of these. I mean, I don't know. It feels idiotic to call them traditional processes,
yeah.
right? Because they're really not. But do you know what I mean? I mean, frequency separation being a good example. Um,
Well, the thing with that is I struggle with the same, and I don't know if it's because I'm just, like, old school and I'm like, "Oh, screw it, it's a lot easier for me to do it, the old way,"
Yeah.
or if it's really like, "You know what? This slider's not that good, and if maybe I could get the same result by using 3 or 4 sliders or different filters or whatever, but, like, I know how to do it frequency separations, I'm just gonna do it there," like, so I
yeah,
still don't know if I'm where I am personally in that battle, but I
yeah,
feel that maybe I mean, so I'm someone who like really, really not only studies every tool in Photoshop. Not only am I involved in the Photoshop uh, pre-release, but like I do talk to a lot of the engineers before some of the tools make it to like even beta. So like I'm well aware how a lot of this stuff works. And even then, I'm like, I still think some of the old stuff, again, to use that word old, is better, or faster or easier for me at least. And I don't think it's because I'm just been using Photoshop forever and I'm just like a, get off my lawn old man wanting to use, the clone stamp tool or whatever. But I do find that some of these, again, perfect example, channels. Channels have been the same since Photoshop was created and they're still useful today. And I haven't found a tool that does everything channels can do, like, for example, for making selections or, different types of things. So there you go, there's some tools that will always be beneficial.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing for me is there's certain elements like when I think of a tool like Apathy, for example,
Mhm.
or all photo, there's certain elements where I'm sold. Eyes
Yeah.
sold,
Mhm.
completely
Yes.
sold.
Mhm.
Um, hair, not really, not sold at
Mhm.
all.
Mhm.
Skin, I'm battling with that.
It for certain things is great, and see, this is the thing, like, when people tell me, "Oh, well, I found this tool," we'll say about, "Oh, it's better at Photoshop than X, Y, and Z." I'm like, "Yeah, it is, 100%. There's no argument there, but Photoshop is better at everything. Meaning, if you know how to use Photoshop, nothing is as good as Photoshop. Now, if the argument is this particular tool is better than Photoshop at this particular task and you can do it 2 times faster, I will agree all day long.
Yeah,
And I am not saying you should only use Photoshop. I'm saying use every tool at your disposal that helps you get your work done. But ultimately, in my opinion, you're going to put it all together in Photoshop. Because usually what I do is I have used Devoto and I do use it. And I just, bring my image right back into Photoshop and it just becomes one of the edit layers or retouch layers or whatever I call it.
correct. Actually, that's exactly right. That's exactly what I do. It comes back. My workflow is, I don't know. I have no idea how common it is. But my workflow, yeah, I start in Lightroom. I
Hmm.
then usually, hop into something else. It then lands in Photoshop,
Hmm.
especially if there's like compositing to do, I need to fix
Sure.
backgrounds or whatever. And
Yeah.
then I always end up back in Lightroom for some final touches.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
that's kind of how, I don't know, that's how I naturally function. And that's just, you know, so things, tools like Evolver or Apathy to me, it's just another thing that actually speeds up certain things. And
Hmm.
as a,
Yes.
as a portrait and headshot photographer, a lot of the time is money. It's just really as
Hmm.
simple as that.
Yes.
I don't really have the luxury to spend as much time as I want on a project because it immediately means that it becomes less lucrative for me because,
Yes. But it goes back to you being an art director, right? So like you're making an executive decision. Is me spending 2 hours on this using frequency separation worth it? Or am I gonna get a result that's, I hate saying good enough, but that it's as good or almost as good, 98% there, but then do it in like 10% of the time. You're gonna make that decision. And
and yeah, you're
yeah,
right.
no.
And the other thing is, of course, this is in my job. It's there's always the central question: is how good is good enough?
Mhm.
Because the the end use of it is absolutely central for me in how far I push the editing. Like
Yeah.
a good
Mhm.
example would be the job is create email signature images that are 190 by 190 pixels.
Mhm.
Uh, there's absolutely zero reason why I should dive into the depth of skin retouching for that because
Mhm.
nobody's ever going to see that,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Um, on the contrary, if I'm doing something that ends up on a billboard or on the side of a bus or something like that,
Mhm.
completely different story. That's a completely different thing. And so likewise, for a regular, a headshot that will only ever exist in digital form, potentially be on somebody's website, maybe be used as a LinkedIn profile picture, on social media. There's also sort of a limit as to how far I'll
Mhm.
take it, and therefore certain AI-based tools will come in really handy
Mhm.
because they completely cut out certain elements. Like I mean, I
Yeah.
mentioned eyes earlier. To me,
Mhm.
I don't. Once I've run a portrait through Aperty and let Aperty do its eye enhancement, there's virtually nothing
Mhm.
I have left to do on these
Mhm.
eyes.
Yeah.
I'm done. You know,
Yeah. No,
with that.
absolutely. Absolutely. Same here. Like, can I do it manually? Sure. But why am I spending the time doing that when a tool like that could do it just by dragging a couple sliders?
Absolutely. Do you, how do you draw the, like, where do you draw the line when you say, like, okay, enough is enough? Because this is one problem that I have sometimes. Is like, when do you know you're done? You've finished it, you're
Mhm.
done with that image.
Well, luckily for me in my commercial work, there's an art director that says you're done. And a lot of the times I disagree, but hey, if he wants me to work more on it, I get paid more. So, I shouldn't complain if he tells me to do more, but or she. But personally, it's very difficult for me because there's always more you can do. There's always more you could do. But at some point, you're just wasting time because yes, well, you can make it more perfect, more better for, by doing whatever enhancement. Is it really gonna be noticeable for most people? And the answer is no, very rarely. But a lot of the times I do it for if it's just my work just for me and nobody else is, hiring me to do, it's whenever a lot of the times I know this is too much. Nobody's gonna care. But then in my mind is, but I care. So then I spend another 2 hours. So I don't have a good answer for you because I'm really bad because I care a lot and I push things a lot further than I probably need to. Um, and also, since it's just for me, a lot of the times I'll get a crazy idea and then I think, oh, well, what if I try this crazy things? And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And, like I teach myself new things. So I don't know. It's hard for me to say. Like, one of the blessings of doing what I do is that there is a person, whether I agree with them or not, they'll tell me you're done.
But it's a great thing about personal projects, when you do stuff just for yourself, because
Hmm.
that's this a fertile ground where you push yourself further and
Yeah.
actually you learn,
Yes.
you know, a new tool or a new technique, especially in Photoshop. I mean, it's endless. You can
Yes.
spend the rest of your life.
Yes. And that's what I would recommend people to work on personal projects, whether they're doing this professionally or not. If you want to get better at not just Photoshop, any tool, just do personal projects, but try to like challenge yourself in doing something you haven't done before. Maybe you see something online that you like and try to figure out how they did it, or follow a tutorial. Just keep pushing yourself because I think one of the most detrimental things you could do is just staying in that same narrow lane and never, going out of it because I don't think you'll grow. You might be very, very good at that one tiny little specific thing, but then, you're very limited. And I think in today's world, if you're doing this professionally, especially, I feel like you have to learn how to do a lot of things and wear a lot of hats. Because at least from what I'm seeing in the world that I'm involved in, if you just wear one hat, it's gonna be very difficult to continue to get work, especially since AI is taking jobs, and I do admit that. But I think that you can make yourself more valuable by knowing more things.
Hallelujah. And at that point, I'm going to switch to this view because I got to say this. Um, I preach personal projects or the benefits of personal projects all the time. So if you're watching this right now, if you're listening to the audio version, I want you to come back to me and let me know what the latest personal project that you've been working on is, because I'm really interested to see what people are working on, and if you have been playing with some ideas, get started, put into action, and get started on it now. Please let me know. You can message us or me on Instagram, or you can join our Facebook group. Let me know what you're working on at the moment. I'd be super interested because I love personal projects. I believe that, just like many of our guests, you hear here all the time if you're following the podcast, personal projects are the single most greatest tool to allow you to grow as a photographer, as a video maker, as an image maker, and as a creative in general. So, make sure you put it in the comments if you're watching on YouTube. Hit us up on Facebook and our Facebook group, and let me know because I'd be super interested. Anyway,
Mhm.
back to the program. um, what would you recommend for people? Um, what's the best way to grow confidence in your own edits? Because I remember when I first started out, you know, I, I, I was lacking confidence in the images that I was creating. Do you have any tips?
So I grew up an athlete. As we discussed earlier, I played football, and I use a lot of sports analogies to this world, even though they may not be seen similar. And one of the ways that you grow confidence in a sport is just by training and practicing and doing things over and over and over and over and over until you're good at them. And eventually you'll be confident because you've done it so much. So going back to the personal project thing, that's one way. Just doing things over and over and over again, realizing that you are just quote unquote training and practicing, that you are going to fail, you are going to fall, but if you keep pushing yourself, eventually there's gonna be a point where you're gonna be like, I'm good at this. Maybe not the best in the world, maybe, better than you were, last year. And I think that helps build confidence, is just putting in more work, more effort, but not letting it get into your head that I'm not as good as this person, not as good as that person. It's just how good were you compared to a week, a month, a year ago, and just keep pushing through. Like, for me personally, I've told a story in, on other podcasts where when I started with Photoshop, like, I got obsessed, and this is now we're talking about, like, 2001, and I bought a training course from Deke McKellen. I don't know if you know who he is, but in one of the best Photoshop instructors ever. The other one is Burt Monroy. I also bought a book of his, but the point is with, Deke's 30-hour Photoshop course, this Photoshop 7, I watched that thing 3 times, and for maybe 6 months, I would do Photoshop all day, every day, for hours and hours and hours, and I tried every single one of the exercises, that he had on his course, and then from trying an exercise, I remember thinking, "Oh, well, maybe I can do this, or maybe I can do that," and, like, if I were to show you these things, they're all ugly, they're all terrible, they're really, really bad, but I was learning, you know? And at the time, I didn't know that I was building confidence. I just found it fun and enjoyed it. And yeah, I thought, oh my God, look, this looks terrible. But guess what? Now I know what a layer mask is. Guess what? Now I know what blend diff is. And you fast forward 2 years later, I'm in university, and without sounding too cocky, there was no one, even the instructors, who could touch me at Photoshop because I had spent so much time putting in the time, the effort, the training, much like being an athlete. So yeah, I always think about sports when I think about this world.
What made you think about setting up a YouTube channel to teach Photoshop to start with?
Good question. So at the time, 2012, I was working at a marketing agency. We created content, marketing materials for doctors of chiropractic. And I was hired as a web developer. Prior to that, I was working for Motorola as a web developer. I worked for them for, I don't know, a year and a half or so, and I hated corporate America. Which is funny because all my clients now are corporate America clients, but that's a whole different. I don't necessarily work directly for them, so maybe I guess that's why it's okay. But the point is that I hated working for corporate America, and I went to work for this very small marketing company. And as I mentioned, I was working as a web developer, doing a lot of coding, which I really enjoyed, but I didn't enjoy it as much as creating graphics. So I decided to start creating graphics for fun, and then I thought, "Oh, maybe I could teach people how to do this." Because people would tell me, "Oh, you're pretty good. You should show how to, like, do that on YouTube." And I'm like, "Okay, that sounds like a great idea." So then if you go back and watch, like, my first, I don't know, 10, 15 tutorials, they're long. They're like half an hour. One of them is like an hour, and they're creating like these big giant projects. One movie poster, actually. Yeah, I wasn't making movie posters at the time, but I made one. I think it was for one of the Jason Bourne movies. I kind of replicated one of the posters, but the point is that I was creating these big, huge projects, and in my mind, I was thinking I'm gonna create a YouTube channel that teaches people, like advanced people like me, Photoshop, because I thought there's no one teaching advanced stuff, which ended up being a mistake because advanced people really don't go on YouTube to look for Photoshop tutorials. But it ended up being good in the context that it was different enough that it started getting traction. But then eventually I had to pivot and start creating content for beginners. And that's when the YouTube channel really took off, and when it started doing really well.
I think this is probably this is the pyramid um idea whereby you have the big base. It's the same thing in like things like music tuition, for example.
Mhm,
Where I used to run a private music school many years ago,
mhm,
and one of the things that I found very often when I hired teachers was that you know A lot of the time, the attitude was like, "Oh, I only want to teach advanced students
Mhm.
because I think I'm so good,
Yeah.
that I will only take on grade 8 plus,
Mhm.
college
Mhm.
level players." And immediately, from my perspective, running a business, I'm thinking, "Well, you're not gonna have much work, dude. That's not
Yeah.
gonna happen," you know?
Exactly. Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
thing. If you wanna work and, pay your rent and, like, make a living, you're gonna have
Mhm.
to go in where the wide base of the pyramid is, which is all
Yes.
the beginners, and
Yes.
the idea is that over time, as people give up on the instrument, that pyramid, gets narrower and narrower until you get to the
Mhm.
very, very tip of it where the pro players live.
Mhm.
Um and depending on where you jump in terms of the level of student you want to teach, that gives you an idea as to how large your audience actually is,
Mhm.
in a way. And
Yeah.
so it makes perfect sense, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. And, don't get me wrong, every now and again, I'll throw in, like, a really advanced tutorial on my YouTube channel, and they're usually the lowest performing ones, and in my mind, I'm like, "Oh my god, this is because like, like, you kinda know, like, oh, yeah, somebody has already made a retouching video or whatever, like, remove wrinkles or whatever. But then I made a video not too long ago about how to create your own parametric filters in Photoshop using Adobe Designer, and nobody watched that video. But there's not a single, to my knowledge, maybe there is now, but at the time, there wasn't anybody who showed how to do that in Photoshop. It's just so advanced that, like, why would you even want to? Or, like, but you can, and I thought it'd be super cool because nobody has ever seen this, and yeah, there's a reason, because no, first of all, it's super advanced, so a beginner wouldn't be able to even see the value or benefit. Second of all, wouldn't be able to follow along those tools. Third, you need Adobe Designer, which is a separate subscription, not in the Creative Cloud. So there's so many, like, barriers for people to enjoy that type of content. I was recently at a conference with, Lisa was there, and, was Dave Clayton there? I don't remember if Dave was there. Dave has been there in other years. I don't remember if he was there this year, but doesn't matter. And in that conference, it's called Creative Pro. It was in Phoenix, Arizona, just a couple months ago. And I have a lot of close friends, two of which I just mentioned. Another guy is Chris Converse, and, Mark Heaps I mentioned earlier. Anyway, a lot of people who I really look up to and respect when it comes to this sort of stuff. And in that conference, I always try to show something really, really, really advanced because I want to impress my friends. But then nobody in the audience really cares. And at the end of class, the advanced people are the ones that come up to me and, like, that one thing you showed at the end was really good. Like, I've never seen that before. But they're like, no, nobody of the general audience cares. But every now and again, I do like to do something like that.
I find that with some of the tutorials that I make for Platypod,
Hmm.
I teach how to use their tools essentially to make
Yes.
make your videos.
Yes.
And sometimes I think something up. Like I did an advertising shot, which is basically it's called a pour shot. When you have a beer bottle and it's pouring
Hmm.
liquid into a
Hmm.
glass, da da da. And so I thought, well, this is amazing. I love doing this. There's a lot of setup. There's a lot of technique. You have to
Yeah.
come up with interesting concepts of like how to cut the bottom of a beer bottle, and I got some really great tips from like people in the industry that I know, who are like really like super pros and doing that,
Hmm.
creating those kind of shots. I'm like, this is awesome stuff to teach, like nobody ever teaches you how to cut
Hmm.
the bottom of a beer bottle and then pour the liquid through there and
Yeah.
like,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that kind of stuff. And you light the background, it's like, whoa, yes, multiple layers of diffusion, awesome,
Yeah.
Not many people watched it.
Yeah, the people that would enjoy it are on top of the pyramid, like you mentioned earlier.
Yes, exactly right, exactly right.
Yeah.
But when I do something like, um, I don't know, here's how you light a Lego figure. Boom!
Yes,
Like,
yes. Well, the way that, again, analogy with sports, imagine you're a Manchester United player, and then you're teaching a football clinic, and you're teaching people who have never played football before. It was like they started last year, for example. You have to go with the basics. It doesn't matter that you play for Manchester United. You have to go with the bare basics that almost anyone could teach.
Yeah.
I think the advantage of a professional teaching, however, is that you can set people on the right path. I have seen several tutorials online where, like, it might work for a specific image, but if your goal is to be a professional, let me rephrase, not professional, because professional could, like, if I paid you, $20 to do something, you're a professional. But, like, in a production environment, that wouldn't work. There, I see a lot of stuff being taught on YouTube that wouldn't work in a production environment, specifically in the kind of work that I do. So I always try to teach people in a way that I know will help them if they are planning on becoming professionals. And if they're not, that's fine. They're still learning like the proper way of doing things. Um, and maybe that's why some of my stuff could be considered a little more difficult because like, why are you doing that on 3 layers? You could have done it in 1 or whatever. And I'm like, well, yeah, but in the world that I live in, I do need to have the flexibility. I do need to have things modularized because somebody can come and say, hey, you know what? I didn't like the shadows, so I have a shadow, group, and all the shadows disappear. You know what I mean? So like I need to keep everything modularized, everything editable. I mentioned earlier that everything comes in one giant horizontal image, and a lot of the times my Photoshop file gets passed on to other artists that move objects around so they can fit the different solves. Maybe they want to use a Facebook banner, so they got to move things around. So like everything has to be modularized so things don't break if they move a character over to the left or something. And which takes a lot more thinking, it takes a lot more to set up, and that's how I teach my my videos, that's how I teach, and I've seen other people where they're like, "Oh, use the background eraser tool to remove the background," and I'm like, "Oh, that will never work," like in the and, like, once you're deleting a pixel, you're shooting yourself in the foot.
What would be the first thing you would teach a complete novice in Photoshop?
Layers, I think they're very difficult to comprehend for people, it's layers for some reason, if they've never used Photoshop, it's a really difficult concept to understand how when you have one layer on top of another, it covers the one below. Um, and after that would be masks. I think that if you as a user learn layers and masks and exactly what they do from the start, I think you have a really strong foundation. Because I'm surprised when people tell me, "I've been using Photoshop for years and I still don't quite get layers or I still don't quite get masks." And in my opinion, it's just because they don't have a strong foundation. But I think those see, the thing is like understanding the basics is the most important thing, and I think the basics in Photoshop at least are layers and masks. Anything else, even if it's completely different, I still think it applies. And I'm being a little general when I say layers because I'm also talking about type layers, I'm also talking about adjustment layers, I'm also talking about smart objects. So like what are all those different types of layers and what they do and how they relate to layer masks?
I remember when I actually remember when a penny dropped and I understood what smart layers were or smart objects were. I'm like, what? It could do that? Boom. And it's exactly like you're saying, it's basically realizing that now all of a sudden the things that you thought were baked into a layer are now not. They're now completely adjustable after the fact. And this is where something you mentioned a minute ago, that's where the why becomes so important. It's not just the how, because I agree with you. I often see tutorials on YouTube in particular where people teach the how, and the how is relatively straightforward sometimes. It's the why, the reasoning behind it. Why are we doing it this way? Because for X reason, so you can come back later and change things. Especially when an art director comes back to you and says like, "Well, actually, I don't like that. I want you to change this," and you
Mhm.
go, "Uh oh, now I'm gonna have to go back to
Yeah.
the beginning of this
Like
edit."
well, not yeah, and if you use the wrong tool, like, "Uh-oh, I use a background eraser tool and I accidentally erased the guy's foot," like, "What do I do now? I have to go find the original image. Oh, I resized it. Now I have to match the size that it was before because it wasn't a smart object," So, like, there's a lot of different things, and like, I think one of the most detrimental things I gotta say this. I love YouTube. I think YouTube is a fantastic tool. I love AI. I love, all this stuff. I love how anybody could get on YouTube right now and post a video about anything. Love it. One of the drawbacks of that though is that I feel some people just post videos to get views, and to a degree I do as well, right? Like why would I post a video that does is not going to get any views? Of course, I'm trying to post a video that gets views, but I feel that some people post videos because they know it's gonna get views, even though the content, whether it's intentional or not, is detrimental to a user. For example, I again, going to ba I seen a video on, how, like, amazing the background eraser tool is, and I'm like, "Oh my god, this tool is bad for so many reasons." Number 1 is it deletes pixels. Number 2, it uses old, algorithms. To my knowledge, the algorithms have been updated in, like, over 20 years. Um and now we have like the brand new background, the remove background button that uses cloud processing, and does an amazing job, just one click. So like, why is somebody creating a video on this really, really old tool? Well, because it looks great in practice, right? You have an image that it looks like it looks good when you're doing it, but then if you actually analyze the output, it's actually quite bad. But in a video, you can't really, like, people can't really, like, judge that. They just see, "Oh, wow, the person dragged over the arm and the background disappears, incredible." And the tool is called a background removal tool, so that must be what it's for, you know what I mean? And I don't know, I've seen a lot of stuff like that where I'm like, "Ooh, I wouldn't teach it that way," or like, "Ooh, that was plain wrong," but it is what it is.
You know what I often wonder, and I often wondered, is there's a number of Photoshop related channels out there, like Piximperfect, for example, or Flurn, which when I first started, I was watching a lot of Aaron's stuff. I always wonder, like, you guys, do you exchange things between each other, or like, do you look at each other's channel and go like, this is actually pretty cool, or
Well,
like, do you talk behind the scenes, like how does this work?
I'll say this, Aaron Nace is a very good friend of mine. So Aaron, actually, I was just thinking, I haven't talked to her in a couple I was literally thinking that last night. I haven't talked to Aaron in a couple of months. I should give him a call. But Aaron Nace is a very, very good friend of mine. And another good friend of mine is Colin Smith from Photoshop Cafe. I talk to those guys often. I talk to Colin a little more often. But Aaron and I have been friends for years. We actually randomly ended up in Mexico City at the same time, and hung out about a year ago now. And he'll text me, and I'll text him every now and again. But the point is that with those guys, not necessarily, we don't like say, "Hey, did you see this new feature?" And not really, because we're all like part of the pre-release and all that fun stuff. We talk more generally about like, "Oh, what's working for you on YouTube? Oh, short videos. Oh, long videos," or whatever, stuff like that. But what I will say is, um, this is just general. I'm not saying Aaron or Colin, they both have excellent portfolios, but what I'm gonna say is, you should look at like what people have done in terms of like actual work, because there's a lot of people that are really good at presenting, but they don't necessarily have any good work. So like, they have like no portfolio. And then when you really start like, wait a minute, where's like your actual work? You realize that all that they do is training, and that's fine. I mentioned Deke McKellen earlier, and Deke McKellen has been a lifelong trainer. He's an excellent instructor, and I think he knows Photoshop extremely well. But there's other people who like have never like really worked professionally, and while it may be fine for beginners, I think that once you get to an intermediate level, you want to be learning from somebody who has professional training, because you were talking, use the word why, the word that I use is context, because now they're teaching you with that context of how to work in a professional environment. And there's just habits, tricks, techniques that you learn from someone who has been working professionally that you may not from somebody who one day decided, I'm going to teach Photoshop on YouTube.
Yes, you're absolutely right. That completely translates into the world of photography per se.
Hmm.
Where there's a huge difference between doing photography as a hobby or as an enthusiast.
Hmm.
With there's no limitations to anything, no time limitations, potentially no financial limitations either. If you
Hmm.
can afford to buy the latest camera bodies or lenses or whatever, you don't have there's nobody saying, do you we ca- at least maybe except for your wife. It's not what like,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
can't spend another 4 grand on a lens. Yes, I
yeah.
can. you know um but the professional world is very different. I remember, like, for years, um people used to ask me, especially in camera clubs, I used to get this question like, how come you shoot such an old body, and all the lenses, like, because I remember I used to shoot a Nikon D750 for the longest time. An old body, not necessarily, you know, it wasn't, even at the time, it had its advantages, but maybe wasn't quite as professional, in inverted commas. I'm making this symbol. Um,
Yes.
as like the 800 series or whatever. Or certainly not as the D4s and D5s of this world. And there are people asking me this all the time, like, how come you shoot, you know, why do you use that particular camera body? Um, because the thinking is always, well, if you're professional, then you have to have the latest, the best gear.
Hmm.
And I used to
Hmm.
say, like, well, the reality is every time I buy a new camera body or I buy a new lens, I have to justify that expense in my business. You know,
Mhm.
like if I drop another, 3.5 grand, 4 grand on a new camera body or a new lens, I have to actually ask myself, does that make my work better? Is this going to earn me that extra income?
Mhm.
And if it does, fantastic. But more often than not, the answer to that would be no. And at that point, I can't, from a business perspective, I can't justify making that expense because there's no benefit to my business
Mhm.
in that moment.
Yeah.
And that's
Mhm.
why I shoot a camera that's maybe a few years older than, the camera body that you enjoy going to camera club where you just, your thing is, I just want to have the latest tool because it's
Yeah.
fun and
Yeah.
I like gizmos and gear. But for me, I have to make that, every time I buy a new modifier, a new stand, a new light, a new lens, whatever it is, I have to actually justify that against the business. Is this if it and often I'm saying this, often there are instances where, yeah, this allows me to do a new thing and I can make money with it. Cool. A good example would be, I don't know, buying a macro lens. I didn't have a macro lens. A job came up, or you know, multiple jobs came up that required me to purchase one. Yeah, I happily purchased one. It makes sense
Yeah.
because at that
Yeah.
moment, you know. But this is the difference, like between doing something professionally in inverted commas, where it's your income, your job, or just doing it as a hobby, where you can do or not do whatever the heck it is that you want to
Yeah,
do.
and, the same thing happens to me with, like, when people tell me about computers, ask me about computers. So, I use a Windows machine, and I'm sponsored by MSI. And people will tell me, "Well, should I get a Windows or should I get a MSI?" And what I tell people is, like, "Get whatever you want." Like, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. Specifically with Adobe products, they do a really good job in making the app virtually the same cross-platform. They're 99.9% the same. And at the end of the day is how fast is your computer? The operating system is completely up to you. You don't have to have the newest computer. You don't have to have the newest laptop, but it helps if it's a little beefy. So to your point, I don't think, I feel that people put a lot of weight on hardware rather than on the time that they spend using that tool because you can take the best photographer in the world and give them one of those plastic, disposable cameras and they'll get great pictures. Will they get better pictures on a, crazy expensive lens, crazy expensive camera? Absolutely. But at the end of the day is the skill that they have as a photographer. And, I think that and I've seen this in a lot of conferences where they're more gearheads than, like, photographers, where they're talking more about, "Oh, this lens has that, and this camera has this, that, and it's this expensive, and it's that expensive, and I got $50,000 worth of whatever," and I'm like, "Cool, what about the photo?" You know?
Yeah, well, it's the work ultimately that speaks. This is
Yeah,
this is always the thing. Um,
yeah.
so I want to bring this to a close by asking you this question.
Sure.
What would you say is the one big mindset shift that photographers should make about editing in 2025 or at this present moment when we've got all of these, evolving technologies around us?
Understand your reality. What is your reality? Like, are you gonna be a professional? Are you gonna be a hobbyist? Like, what is your reality? Because that's gonna determine really the paths that you need to follow, what you should learn, all these different things. And um, if, like, for example, if my reality is that I'm going to be a professional, then my advice to that would be to try to learn as much as you can. As I mentioned earlier, you're gonna have if you are going to be a professional, you're gonna have to wear a lot of hats. You're gonna have to understand all this technology. You cannot be afraid of learning these new tools. Yes, are you so good at using frequency separation? Fantastic, but learn Evoto, learn all these other tools because as I mentioned earlier, your value is not that you know this recipe for how to create the frequency separation structure with layers and filters and whatever. Your value is that you know what a good portrait looks like, for example. So try to keep learning those tools and use your decades or years of portrait editing knowledge to now take it to all these different tools and techniques and keep evolving, because as much as I love this technology, I do think that it's going to make it harder for people to make money if they're still doing everything the old way. But if you can take that knowledge and shift it over to the new way of doing things, I don't think you have anything to worry about.
Jesus, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for being the guest on the Camera Check podcast this week. I already have several ideas of things that we could talk about. So I'm pretty sure it wasn't the last time. So thank you so much.
Fantastic. No, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, folks, that is it for today. It was an absolute pleasure having Jesus on the show. What a conversation. And as always, before we go, let me recommend another episode that I think you'll enjoy. Check out episode 262, where I talk to Janek Waziak about how to future-proof your photography. I'm sure you'll love it. If you enjoy our content, consider supporting us over at buymeacoffee.com/camerashake. It helps us creating more exciting episodes for you, and we really do appreciate every bit of support. Also, don't forget to sign up to our brand new newsletter over at camerashakepodcast.com. You get early heads up on future guests, behind the scenes content, and useful photography tips delivered straight to your inbox. And for those of you listening to the audio version, did you know that there's a full video version of this podcast over on YouTube? Head over there, search for Camera Shake Podcast, and you'll be able to watch all past episodes in glorious Technicolor over there. I don't know why I can't talk today. It's Friday. That's what it is.
Friday. Yeah, Friday.
It's Friday. If you're already on YouTube, do us a favor, drop us a comment, hit the like button, ring that bell, and share the episode with a friend. Your engagement helps us reach more people all around the world. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, a new episode drops every Thursday. Until next time, keep shaking things up in the world of photography. See you next Thursday.